So the presentation is about how Cluster API Azure is supporting AKS clusters. So what can we do with it and what's required? So just to dive into the details immediately without some big intro. In the Cluster API, so out of entire Cluster API, what we need is basically just a core controller, which is reconciling, not even the entire core controller, the most basic parts like cluster reconciliation and machine pool reconciliation. That at least for the AKS, maybe machine deployment might be necessary somewhere else, but for AKS in Azure, it's machine pool. And I think for EKS in AWS, it's the same. So we do not need a bootstrap controller, kubeadm stuff, because Azure does everything. There is no bootstrapping in AKS, at least. I mean, there is, but Azure does it, so you don't worry about it. And there is no control plane kubeadm controller, which is also a big beast in CAPI, because CAPZ has a control plane type and controller, at least kind of. It's not doing almost anything. It's at least not what you would think that control plane controller is doing. So it's a very basic one, but I'll get to that. So without these, we basically don't have any issues that are main blockers now. So there is no issue with supporting ignition in kubeadm controller. There is no issue how we do control plane reconciliation. Do we use VMSS or HG in AWS, or do we use like plane machines, and how we do it? And there is no issue about migration because there's nothing to migrate to. This would be for new customers and them getting new clusters, or even us supporting their existing clusters. So nothing to worry about backward compatibility with existing stuff. So from CAPZ, that was CAPI, and from CAPZ or Cluster API Azure, what we need is the current experimental support for AKS, which is very bare bones at the moment, but not much is needed actually. So even that bare bones can do something. So there are just 3 CRs around that, one for representing cluster, so Azure Managed Cluster, one for control plane, and one for machine pools. And basically, the reconciliation and the implementation of all of these simply comes down to reading those CR values and just calling Azure API. So there is nothing more to it. It's just talking to Azure API and even talking to basically a single Azure API endpoint for managed cluster. So there are a couple of operations there, and it's only that. You can obviously configure virtual networks and stuff, so do a little bit more around CNI, but that's it. So the amount of technical work required for this is so much less than for regular cluster creation that we are doing and that CAPZ is doing, where we will move to in the future. So the difference is like really huge. And so what we don't need at all is, as I said, we don't need bootstrapping from Cluster API because creating a node pool in AKS is just another Azure API call, so it's either with CLI or talking to API directly. There is no etcd management. You don't see etcd in AKS. You can't be even sure that they are using etcd. For what we all know, it might be some compatibility layer on top of SQL servers, and we would have no clue about it. And for example, certificate rotation is also just another API call in Azure AKS call group, and it should be done at least every 2 years. So it doesn't even have to be implemented in the reconciliation. It can be done manually. For example, some other details. Providing SSH keys for access. You can provide SSH keys on cluster creation, but just a second, I see messages. Yeah, so you can provide SSH keys when the AKS cluster is created, but the bad thing is that you cannot modify that, but you can add more SSH keys, but per machine. So it's not, I guess those will just be removed when machines are rolled maybe, so it's a little bit more tedious to maintain. But yeah, it basically comes down to talking to a few Azure API endpoints, and that's it. And what CAPZ would need from us there is to work on it, actually, because from what I saw recently, the current implementation is super limited. It's very basic. So in the story around the AKS cluster adoption, I was fixing some very basic bugs that I stumbled upon. So we can get some end-to-end tests in upstream. So this is officially supported, and very little features of CAPZ are actually implemented. But luckily, adding new features is just adding a field or two in some CR and then wiring the value from the CR to an API call that is actually already made there. So, and maybe not using some static value or hardcore something value, but actually wire the value from the CR. And basically, from what I saw, there are just only a couple of different API calls that are done in a couple of controllers. So expanding that is not big work. And what maybe will be done in upstream is a bigger refactoring of the entire code base, because it's lagging a little bit behind the remaining CAPZ code base. But I guess it shouldn't be a super big task, and we'll see in the office hours in CAPZ. So that was basically about Cluster API Azure and AKS, which in my opinion looks like a fairly straightforward and simple story that we could achieve relatively quickly if we wanted to. And to just say something about AWS and CAPA support for EKS, I took a quick look. There is experimental support in CAPA, Cluster API AWS. Just by looking at the code and at the docs, it looks better. It looks more advanced than what CAPZ is doing for AKS. You can see similar CRs there, and additionally, what you also have in CAPA for EKS is some story around bootstrapping as well, because apparently AWS supports something, so you can provide some configuration, and that will affect the cloud init that is generated for the machines. So I didn't look deeper into it. I guess Firecracker folks would know a lot more about it, and they would understand the details a lot more. But from the top level point of view, it looks the implementation and the concept look similar, how it's done in CAPZ as well. So again, it looks much more simple than deploying AWS clusters, deploying Kubernetes cluster on AWS the way we do and the way CAPA is doing by default. So also supporting this would require, I believe, a lot less effort than any other AWS support for CAPI that we are doing. So what I was thinking, what came to my mind in the past weeks, because they were mentioning of customers that want to use EKS, customers that want to use AKS. Then again, some customers left because of those. And I believe that on our way to CAPI, the initial effort that we would do, for example, if we just had a management cluster for that can deploy Azure and AWS clusters, that would be basically enough for us to start deploying AKS and EKS clusters. Then it was just a question of working in upstream to have a better support for EKS and AKS, and just to guess when the next customer would come, we would be in a position to say, yes, we have something experimental, or we have some preview. It does work something, so we could talk to them to find out more about their use case, and we would be much closer to actually working with them, I guess, and at least from the technical point of view. And just one comment last about the difference between, at least for CAPZ. So I talked about creating AKS clusters from CAPZ, but when it comes to adoption, there is no much difference. I mean, technically speaking, not much we would change. It's just a question of paying a little bit more attention to how Azure API calls are made, so that Azure do not scream at you when you make when you provide certain parameter or not. So technically speaking, it's not a big difference, because CAPZ controls will just work with existing clusters, and the only limitation is you can work with clusters that are using features only features that are already supported in CAPZ. So it's a question of improving support in CAPZ, and which then translates to CAPZ being able to adopt a more wide range of different AKS clusters, which is, I guess, more useful for potential customers. So yeah, that's it from me.